Hello, and welcome again to our webinar for this afternoon, Advice for the Current Times. I hope you're well. I hope you're having a good week, and I hope this is going to be very useful for you. They usually are when we have our brilliant guest, Guy Dudley, Head of Advice at the NHT. So Advice for the Current Times it is, and a packed agenda, as you'd expect. And during the session, if you'd like to join the discussion on social, you know the drill by now, I think. We use #TheWholeTeacher if you want to connect with other people who are commenting on this and other issues. And if you'd like to find out any more about Discovery Education, NHT Discovery Education Pathway, of course, which we will be mentioning now and again during this afternoon, then the URL is there for you to find out much more about it. And you can even register to have your own no obligation chat to find out much more about what the program is about. But anyway, today is about advice for the current times. And our special guest Guy has elected to choose two big meaty issues today: a guide to diversity and inclusion in schools and your well-being, setting the baseline, which is a really interesting approach for well-being. And I think it's going to be very, very useful and insightful for school leaders out there and teachers too. So it just remains for me to welcome Guy. I hope you're there. And I'll stop sharing.
Hi, Andrew. Hi.
It's great to see you. That was quite interesting because I couldn't see either of us while I was talking then, so it was slightly unnerving actually. But then on the other hand, when you're normally presenting face-to-face in meetings, you can't see yourself. No. So I should be able to cope without having to hold up a mirror.
Absolutely.
What a strange world we're now in, isn't it? Can you imagine being around a table where everybody's discussing and they're holding mirrors so they can see themselves as well? Most unnerving, but really good to see you. And
glad to be here.
So, two big issues today. Why these particularly, Guy?
Well, it comes as no surprise to people, does it, that these are hugely topical issues at the moment. And wherever you look, whether it's social media, print media, the television, broadcast media, it's diversity, the Black Lives Movement, the whole issue of race and equality is just very topical. A very bright light's been shone on it. And I thought actually now's the time to, play our part in raising its profile again and helping school leaders and those working in schools understand what they can do. The well-being ones, it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, isn't it, well-being, but we can't stop talking about it. And I know there's some great stuff that we'll be referring to later on, but I think a lot of people struggle with well-being in terms of not defining it or describing what it is, but perhaps where it starts.
Right.
And so the approach I'm taking this afternoon is, where does well-being start? I can't tell you where it ends because that's a choice for individuals, a profound choice for individuals, but I can tell you where it starts, and again, help those working in schools specifically to understand what they're entitled to as part of their well-being and while they discharge their professional responsibilities. So hopefully we'll have a good engaging session on those two topics.
Terrific, thank you. And as with any of these webinars, during this discussion that we'll have, both Guy and I always appreciate having your comments, don't we? We love to have people's comments, and I will always share them. If you don't mind sharing them with everyone when you post them on there, that's okay. Or if you'd like to submit a question using the Q&A button or just in the chat stream, I'll always post those to Guy. And we've always done that many, many times so far. We've had many of these webinars, and you've never yet not returned it back to us with a brilliant answer. So there, we've laid the gauntlet down today. I'm sure you'll have some insightful answers for everybody. So thank you ever so much. Well, why don't we kick off with hearing your assessment as to what the terms diversity and inclusion mean to you?
Yeah, but gosh, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because different people have different versions of their interpretation. Different dictionaries will have different meanings of it. But I've been involved at the NHT on the diversity and inclusion group for a number of years now. And some of the aspects of it have led us to sort of think the following, really. Diversity for me and for the group is about each individual in the school, their unique experiences, qualities, and characteristics. So diversity is about the individual. Inclusion is about everyone. It's about creating a culture that values multiple differences.
Right.
And I think if you know, some people may hopefully agree, hopefully most people will agree with that definition, but I think it's easier to think about diversity is about each individual, and inclusion is about everyone. And it doesn't really get more complicated than that, Andrew, to be honest.
I think that's a lovely distinction, that is, and it's not a distinction that I've actually heard before, and it seems quite obvious, but I wasn't thinking it until you'd said it. So it's a really nice, simple, clear, and you can tell those of you on the call that this is what these webinars are about. It's about breaking down what can otherwise be quite complex or often misinterpreted terms into a nice, simple way that you can understand it and deliver it as a leader. So what about the duty of schools in these areas then, Guy? Because it's quite complicated, very important.
It is, and schools do have an enormous duty in these areas.
Yeah.
And it won't come as a surprise to most of you that your main duty is guided by a piece of legislation which has been around now for 11 years, called the Equality Act 2010. And all employers must work in step and comply with it. That includes schools. And in short, the Equality Act makes it clear that it is unlawful for an employer to discriminate against, harass, or victimize employees and those seeking work, which we can come back to later. So I suppose to answer your question, Andrew, schools are legally responsible for upholding those values, which are sort of espoused in the Equality Act. And they're also responsible for avoiding acts of discrimination, harassment, and victimization committed by their own employees during their employment, and also other workers under their authority and control. So that could be a contractor, it could be a supply teacher, anyone working primarily at the school and principally under the control of the school, but not necessarily employed by the school. Yeah. And you know, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I won't go on further because we'll talk about it as we carry on the discussion. But effectively, the Equality Act is the piece of legislation that somebody at your school, whether it's the school leader, the school business manager, or a dedicated leader, really needs to get a grasp of and understand the school's responsibilities. But it's pretty straightforward.
And we're going to be sharing these notes, aren't we, actually? The webinar is going to be archived and recorded so you can see it again on demand. But we're going to issue some notes to accompany this. And also, of course, as you know, because you've written it, one of the reasons for holding this webinar now is because you've just launched another huge newsletter, which we do these half-termly newsletters within Pathway. And those of you on the call who are already subscribing to Pathway, and I know there's many of you who are, you'll be pleased to hear that there's another newsletter that's landed. And we're really talking about some of the issues in that newsletter, aren't we? We're sharing it here today. That's what we're doing.
Absolutely.
So what is protected then? What exactly is protected?
Well, I expect listeners will have their pen and papers at the ready now, because they'll be busy writing down the 9 areas that are protected, and I'll go through them very quickly. Yeah. It's age. This is in alphabetical order. Disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, sex, sexual orientation, race and religion or belief. And I wanted to just pause on that last one, Andrew, if I may, belief, because many of the listeners may know, and some won't, that there's a new movement that has now been classified under the Equality Act as a belief system that's recognised under the Equality Act 2010. Mm-hmm. And it followed a very high-profile case last year by a vegan, and veganism is now protected under the Equality Act as a belief system. So it's not mentioned specifically, but it comes under the religion or belief. And there's a piece that we've written, or I've written, working with vegan inclusive education. I've drafted a piece that's now on our advice hub.
Do you want me to share that very quickly?
If you could share that quote very quickly. I know we're going down a little bit of a cul-de-sac, but it's a very relevant cul-de-sac.
That's okay. So we're in the platform. Carry on, Guy. I'll just find it while you're speaking. We're in the reflection section.
And what I've done here, folks, is written a piece on veganism in schools in particular, because it does have implications for schools, especially your catering teams and probably your school business manager and their role in this. And you can see that I've sort of outlined there the key headings and the key links to those people that you may want to call on. And you do have a responsibility under the Equality Act to offer things like vegan options in your school, or to begin the planning process for doing that. This is a short document. I think it's about 4 pages long. Mm-hmm. So it's a cup of coffee read.
Yep.
Might be an idea for, ask 1 or 2 people at the school to read it on your behalf, vegans and non-vegans alike. But again, that's just been added under the statutes, regulations and policies section, because there is a legal compliance piece under the Equality Act. So a lot of people might think, why on earth are we writing about veganism for? But I'll tell you 2 compelling reasons. 1, it's now the law, and 2, schools have to comply with it. It's really pretty straightforward as that.
So thank you, Guy. So if discrimination does happen, what form could it take? For example, direct discrimination, indirect, and so forth. Do you want to maybe talk us through that so that we can identify it and call it out and deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll do very quickly, there are 4 types of discrimination. These are all in the notes with examples.
Great.
So, I've put a couple of examples for each of these. So direct discrimination is what it says on the tin. Somebody is discriminated against because of their protected characteristic. So an example I'm going to give you, there are 2, but I'll give you 1 of the 2. I'll give you one that may be very relevant to schools in particular. So a post is advertised for a new teacher, a new ICT teacher. Susan applies for the role, and she's 60 years old. If Susan wasn't considered for the job because it's assumed that she's not familiar or comfortable with new technology compared with a younger person, this would be direct discrimination against someone seeking work in relation to their protected characteristic of age. Fairly straightforward, simple example there. There's another example there as well in the text that people can have a look on. Interestingly, direct discrimination can be broken down a little bit further, because it can be broken down into what are called associative discrimination and perception discrimination. So, for example, I'll give you an example of associative discrimination. Teacher in a school, Laura, these are purely fictitious, by the way, has been told she'll be promoted. Just before this happens, she discloses that her daughter has a disability. On learning this, the school withdraws the promotion, claiming that Laura would be unable to focus entirely on her new role because of the perceived duty of care she would need to fulfill to provide her daughter. This would be associative discrimination. I'm glad I got my teeth in this afternoon. Of an employee because of Laura's association with a disability, and it's a direct association. So that's a good example of direct discrimination.
We've had an interesting comment from Lorraine, actually. Assumptions are hard to prove, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely, which really makes them, which is why they're an assumption. I mean, I think you can't have any. If you do, and let's be frank. I mean, if a school does have a concern because they're thinking of putting someone into a role, and they know of something else that's happening in their life, the reasonable thing would be to sit down with them and to talk about it in the first instance, and see whether there could be any adaptations made to the role on offer or to that person's ability to fulfill the role.
In doing so, you're not placing yourself in a vulnerable position, are you, by raising that? You're not making any preconceived ideas or judging it.
No.
You're just raising it to...
If it's knowledge that you know, or it's knowledge you suspect, there's no harm in raising it. And I think everyone, any reasonable person would find that an entirely acceptable approach in those situations.
Yeah. So, sorry, do you want to continue or move on to the public sector equality?
Well, I will just mention, I'll go into indirect discrimination, because harassment and victimisation are pretty much what they do on the tin, and I've put examples of those there. But indirect discrimination is one where lots of school leaders come unstuck because it's harder to put a finger on. So indirect discrimination occurs when a school practice, it could be a policy or a procedure or custom and practice, negatively impacts on those sharing a protected characteristics or a protected characteristic. So the Equality Act doesn't define the practice. It's just something that happens in the school that could unfairly unintentionally treat people with a protected characteristic. So, for example, I'm going to stick with one that sticks with age, a requirement for a job which is advertised that all applications, or all applicants rather, have 10 years experience in the field, would mean that a younger person could be well qualified but ineligible to apply for the job because they haven't got 10 years experience for it. That would amount to indirect discrimination for job seekers in relation to age. And the reason it's difficult, Andrew, it's often unintended by school leaders. And I've put 3 examples there of the types of trouble that school leaders can get themselves into. Really they've absolutely unintentionally gone out and with an offer, a practice or a procedure, but actually, coincidentally, it actually treats those with a certain protected characteristic unfairly.
Absolutely. So thank you, Guy. And these notes are so helpful, I must admit. Do you want to look at public sector equality duty now? Moving on, just looking at time.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had a lot of questions over the years from school leaders about what is this public sector equality duty? I keep hearing about it, not quite sure what it means. And it's a statutory duty for all public bodies, including schools, to have regard to 3 things: to eliminate unlawful discrimination, to advance equality of opportunity between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't, and to foster or encourage good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who don't. And whenever I see "have due regard to," I'm always a little bit suspicious of that term. It means that schools must consciously consider setting out how they do these 3 things, or how they aim to comply with the duty.
Yeah.
So it's very much a statutory duty. As its title suggests, it's all applicable to all public sector organisations. There are 3 objectives, and the Equality Act just adds 2 more, which again schools must comply with, which are the specific duties, which help them to comply with the public sector equality duty. They must publish information to show that it is complying with the duty on an annual basis. And most schools will have that on their website. And schools must prepare and publish 1 or more objectives which further the 3 aims of this equality duty. Sometimes, Andrew, it's best that the school leader perhaps dedicates this function to someone with a particular interest in it on their leadership team or amongst the middle leader. This isn't for all school leaders to do, it's for them to do or to delegate. but this is often a good one to delegate to someone who has a genuine interest in the subject area.
And is this advice relevant, thank you, Lorraine, for charities as well? Question from Lorraine, does it include charities?
It could do, depending whether the charity, how far the public funds support the charity. I mean, there are charities out there that get no donations from public funding, and there are some that are almost exclusively. My background's in charity, as you know, Andrew, and some of them were. One of the charities I worked for got an enormous amount of funding from the public sector, from DFID. But along with that, we had to satisfy the public sector equality duty. Yeah. Okay. So I think it would depend on the contracts you have in place with your public sector funders, okay. If they do exist, whether or not there would be a condition to satisfy the public sector equality duty.
I'm inferring from that, perhaps incorrectly, that the public sector equality duty doesn't apply to independent schools then? Doesn't apply to independent.
Again, it's a little bit like the charities. Some some private schools are exclusively privately funded. Some may get some support from local authorities. It's highly unlikely. Yeah. It's highly unlikely that they would need to. But I think the spirit of the public sector equality duty is where an organisation is principally funded by public funds. That they want to see those funds are being used in the spirit of national law.
Of course. So, because it's public money.
Absolutely.
So, should we move on to supporting diversity and inclusion in school? What schools can do to support diversity and inclusion, and perhaps we get onto the part that school leaders can play particularly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so far we've talked about the minimum schools could do. And I'm always interested in these whole areas of diversity and inclusion because there's always going to be a minimum, and the minimum is legal compliance. Yeah. And of course, commitment to it isn't necessarily limited to that legal compliance. A commitment to it could be that the school sets out a moral case for doing it that goes way and beyond the compliance issue. So I think it starts like everything, Andrew, and I know you'd agree, and I'm sure most of the listeners would, if not all. It starts with leadership. Mm-hmm. The commitment to inclusion requires a huge effort and genuine effort by a school's senior leadership team. And whether the school has it in their vision, that pretty much cements it into the way they do things. Whether it embeds it in its policies and practices, but where I've seen this done through leaders, and where there have been genuine attempts by leaders to do that, it actually provides a much better reputation for the school to be an employer of choice, and it actually delivers a greater pupil experience as well. So there are some real benefits to be derived from the leadership taking control and ownership of this. I think it starts with leaders in that first instance. If you haven't persuaded the leader and the governing body in most schools, then it will be an uphill struggle. But I think if you speak their language and say, we are more likely to become an employer of choice, a school of choice, and we're more likely to be welcomed by children of all backgrounds, and give them a better and greater experience and richer experience. There are huge benefits to be derived from really committing yourself to these principles.
For sure. And with that in mind, actually, you've done some cracking documents in the Advice Hub in Pathway on the subject of diversity and inclusion, haven't you? There's a number of different ones in there that leaders could probably benefit, would benefit a lot from reading.
They have. I mean, I've prepared 3 documents because it's such a broad topic area, and I don't know whether you're going to give people
I'm happy to. If we
glimpse of that, Andrew, that'd be great.
Yes, of course. I'll just give a break.
While you're finding that, I'll just let people know that I've prepared a document called The Basics, which is what you've got to do. I've prepared a document that talks about how you can best support diversity and inclusion in your school. And I've also talked about what to do when things go wrong. It's under the statutes.
Forgive me.
Andrew.
I went to HR. So sorry.
That's okay. So yeah, it's under our statutes, regulations, and policies because it's a legal compliance matter. Unfortunately, for we have to decide where these things go. But there's the document about supporting diversity and inclusion with leadership, commitment, and the benefits that it can bring to your school, to not only parents and pupils, but to your school staff. School staff are more likely to be attracted to schools where there's an enlightened approach to these things.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. So should we move on unless there's anything else on that particular point?
No, absolutely.
Move on to we've talked about, well, have we talked perhaps about what good practice actually looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll touch on this and putting it at the heart of the school as well. It's pretty straightforward to implement good practice. I mean, certainly you can review all your policies around recruitment, promotion, career development. So that's where you can pretty much cover every policy and procedure. You can certainly provoke open discussions with employees in your school about diversity and inclusion. Great idea for an inset day, and I know schools have done that and have really benefited from it. Clearly, you can get involved in staff development and training your staff so that they are able to conduct themselves and carry themselves appropriately, and know what's expected of them. And another area that has proven very successful, especially in London, is an area, is a practice called reverse mentoring. And some of you may have come across this. The idea behind the program of reverse mentoring is that it equips senior leadership teams with a better understanding of the experiences of colleagues from, example, Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. So in practice, where this happens is that senior leaders have been paired with a junior BAME mentor to discuss their experiences at work and in life, sharing their stories about inclusion at work. It's also been targeted at the LGBT plus community and also genders, where a man and a woman are paired together. It's an interesting concept and one that's quite common in the States, less common over here.
Both people benefit. I mean,
yeah, I think it's fascinating. I mean, it's a real. I mean, we always think of mentoring, don't we, as an upward. You mentor with someone with broader experience than yourself, and generally that person is going to be more senior. But in inclusion, a really good practice in schools where I've seen it done is it's called reverse mentoring. I won't go into it here because it's not complex, but it is pretty much what I've said it is. And you can Google it and you'll get the 27 million responses. But, there are some good programs out there of reverse mentoring. So I'd encourage schools perhaps to look at that as well. I think, the only other thing I was going to mention that, Andrew, because I think it's so important that listeners and all the work that I've done with certainly the Vegan Society. I've done an awful lot of work with Stonewall, the LGBT lobbying organisation. And the one thing they all say to me, the one thing they all have in common is that only when all members of staff can be their true selves at work will the school benefit from the best everyone can be.
Beautiful.
I know that's a very prophetic and ambitious statement, but I think it's, if you can be your true self, you're going to give your best to the school, and inclusion is probably the best way of encouraging people to be themselves.
Yeah, nicely put. And you can be the role model for the children then, can't you? The model learner.
Absolutely.
What about when things go wrong? What could be done then, perhaps, when things, you wanted to mention about that?
Things inevitably will go wrong. I mean, they do in every area of practice, don't they? And clearly the school has a responsibility to put it right. And I'm not going to dwell on this because there's lots of notes in the paper and the handout we're giving to people. But I think you have to understand that if a complaint is made about workplace discrimination, you must take it seriously. You must keep an open mind, and you must treat that person fairly. Now, I don't want those comments to appear to be rather simple, but they are often complaints in this area of work are taken with a slightly less serious note, and a person can complain and raise another grievance about how it's dealt with in the first place, rather than what tool you use to deal with it. I think, let's keep life simple. If someone raises a complaint or a concern, you would always try and deal with it informally. But if that isn't possible, you would then use the school's grievance procedure, because that's what is the common go-to policy for complaints that are made. I've put notes on this, Andrew, which approach you take, because even if you take an informal approach, it's important to do it in the right steps.
Yes, you've put the steps in the notes, actually.
Absolutely. So, for those of you who think, actually, I've got one or two of these issues and I'd love to be able to deal with them, but I'm not quite sure it's easy to jump into the formal approach because it's all set out in a policy. Informal approaches are often more difficult because they're more nuanced. So I've put all the steps that you would need to follow in an informal approach, as well as handling a grievance. So, in some respects, that's all sort of set out for people. And, if there are cases to answer, and there will be in some schools at certain points in their future, some of the common actions, of course, with this area, and it is a sensitive area, maybe mediation. It could be more training for staff. Or it could be disciplinary action where there's been a willful breaking or willful act of discrimination with little remorse or little room for any informal approach. But you'd always try and start with those sort of softer approaches in the first instance, knowing that you've got that hard nut approach to take if all of those fail.
Absolutely. And you wanted to round this little section off with considering a lessons for the future approach, which is a nice way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think, whatever the outcome of incidents that happen at your school, and there'll be positive, incidents that happen as well. It could be a great inset day discussion.
Yeah.
It could be a difference of opinion between someone who has a protected character and those that haven't, but they reach an understanding. It's making sure that you've got something that is able to capture that, perhaps in some sort of training or an inset day or in a policy, and reflect on, that went well, so therefore we must do more of it.
Yes.
And we must make sure that we capture what went well and put it in our policy. The trouble is we're also busy, and I completely appreciate that. Someone who's worked in the NHT doesn't need persuading that school leaders aren't busy for 8 years.
Everything's a priority.
It is, but I think, as I put in the notes here, reflecting on whether there's anything further you can do to embed it within your school is time well spent.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And can certainly outweigh the time that you'd spend putting something that went wrong right.
Absolutely, and you're building it into the culture of the school, aren't you? That's the point. You really are.
Absolutely. And culture is a continuous process. It doesn't just sort of open a packet, add water and mix and produce the product. It's a continuous commitment and small acts of commitment that help to sustain, build, and more importantly, sustain that culture.
Brilliant. We could go on and on about it. It's such an important subject, but your notes really do provide the detail that you've been kind of referring to briefly today. So I would strongly recommend that people read those as soon as they're issued and sent to you. Shall we move on in the last few moments to wellbeing? And you've got a very interesting idea to talk about the baseline, which as a former head teacher myself, I think understanding the obligations and the responsibilities and the rights is a key piece for unpicking wellbeing, isn't it? Because a lot of people are talking about it.
It is, and I'm sure lots of people have perhaps raising their eyebrows or sort of, cleaning their ears out to listen to this piece. I take quite a different approach to wellbeing than to most, in that we all know what it is. It's stuff that you do that makes you feel better. That we could carry on an hour or two discussing that. Yeah. What I'd like to do, Andrew, is set the baseline for people so they know where well-being starts. So if you like, it's a nebulous, intangible concept, well-being, but I think for a lot of people who are more familiar with a particular document, they'll say, oh no, it isn't. It's something that we're entitled to. So I just wanted to demystify that for a few minutes. Right. Now, some of you will have heard of a document called the STPCD. It took me about 6 months to master saying it fairly quickly. The STPCD. It's the School Teachers Pay and Conditions document.
Right. I remember it well.
Also known as the STPCD or the document. It's produced every September by the Department of Education, and it's available online. And I've put the link there for you in the paperwork, so you can click it and go straight to it. It's 84 pages long, and it applies to everyone on a teaching contract in England, a qualified teaching contract in England. Wales has its own version, and I've put the link there. And Northern Ireland also has a version, and I've put the link there as well. So wherever you're listening, we can cater for you. And there's a part of the STPCD, part 7, which sets out the contractual framework for all teachers. And I say all teachers, that includes head teachers, middle leaders, and teachers, and their statutory responsibilities and their statutory entitlements. And it's the wellbeing bit that I just wanted to highlight here. So what I'm going to do is answer 2 questions that I've put in the notes, because I think sometimes this comes as a surprise to some head teachers. I've been talking to head teachers on a daily basis for 8 years, and occasionally when I talk to them, they're not having a great time, and they're not having a great time because they're so busy, they're really unable to see the wood for the trees. So on page 45, and this is for all head teachers, you are entitled to dedicated headship time. It doesn't specify how much. It just says head teachers are entitled to a reasonable amount of time to discharge their leadership and management responsibilities. They're also entitled to a daily break of reasonable length.
All right.
Isn't it wonderful? Reasonable length. Right. In the course of each school day.
Yeah.
There is a condition to that, Andrew, though, that they must arrange for a suitable person for deputise for them during that break.
When they're in the pub, yeah.
It's actually great development for if you're lucky to have a deputy or an assistant head to say, right, well, I'm having my daily break. It's over to you now to lead the school for half an hour, 20 minutes, an hour.
Good for them as well. So important.
But I think the baseline is for school leaders and head teachers and executive head teachers and so on, is that you are entitled to this. It's not a nice, it's not a, wouldn't it be nice to have if I had the time?
Okay.
And I've persuaded some head teachers to actually start planning their diary with this in mind.
Yeah.
So instead of putting the parents, teacher, I'd say to them, start by putting your dedicated headship time and daily break in the diary first, and then work around it. Because if you start the other way around and just fill it full of tasks and activities, you won't have space to put in your dedicated. It's a small tip, but it's a very, very powerful one.
Right. I found I had no breaks at all, and my dedicated headship time was a Sunday night. It's bonkers, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That is the fact, because the rest of the time you're kind of just operational stuff and firefighting and everything else.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue, but
no, that's fine. I mean, and again, for the statutory time entitlements for all other teachers, and this includes middle leaders, so deputies, assistants, subject leads, etc., and anyone who's a qualified teacher. So I won't read the detail out because there's more of them, but I'll just quickly go through the list. And a couple of starters for 10, because needless to say, we get some questions at the NHT about, well, we want our teacher to work on a Saturday. Or we've closed the school on a Thursday afternoon for a deep clean. We want them to work on a Sunday morning to catch up. No teacher in this country or the other countries are required to work at weekends or on bank holidays or to carry out midday supervision. Now, I don't want to sound too much of a trade union official because I'm reading out your entitlements, but you've got to, in a sense, some people need to be told that they have to understand these matters so that those questions are avoided. And they can begin to build them into their diary. And the best tip I can give to middle leaders as well and other teachers is start with putting these things in your diary first. Put your work commitments in them and around them. So, for example, I'm talking about a daily break, work-life balance, and I'll just comment on that very quickly, Andrew. Governing bodies and head teachers must have regard to the need for the head teacher and teachers to be able to achieve a satisfactory work-life balance. So they must must consciously consider how that's achieved. We all know that teachers are entitled to PPA time, and that's no less than 10% of a teacher's timetable teaching time. Management time. If you've got management or leadership responsibilities, you are entitled to a reasonable amount of time off. Cover. If you're asked to provide cover, you should only do so rarely and only in circumstances that are not foreseeable.
So
this is a key one when schools are taking industrial action for whatever reason. When a teacher who's not a non-union member may be asked to provide cover. And the NEHT also always advise head teachers not to ask them because by covering classes, you're sort of rather frustrating the purpose of the industrial action.
Aren't you? Yeah.
Which is probably rather, is underpinned by some good stuff. The last two things here, administration. Teachers should not be routinely carrying out general administrative tasks that don't call for their professional skills and judgment. And training and development, all teachers should have access to advice, training and development opportunities appropriate to their needs, including those identified in objectives and appraisal statements and reports. Now that list is in the handout, so anyone can look at that at their leisure. But I think, the reason, just finally from me, Andrew, the reason I wanted to make these clear is this is where your well-being starts. What you do after that is entirely up to you, and I guess down to you and the relationship you have with your employer, boss, line manager. But I think if people understand where it starts, they're more likely to engage with it rather than dip in and out of it on a sort of a fairly unstructured ad hoc basis.
Absolutely right. And that's the right approach. And that's why you were so keen to talk about it today. So lots of really good stuff in the piece that you're going to send to everybody on this call now. By virtue of registering for this webinar, you are certainly entitled to read all these notes, which is great. And of course, you expand on all of these in the newsletter, which has just landed in Pathway in the Advice Hub, which I'll give viewers a quick look at that if they're able to stay on.
Right.
Finished actually. I'll show the Advice Hub in some detail and all the brilliant pieces that are in there, and the newsletter especially, because we're really proud of you've written it, the latest newsletter. Okay. Always good to speak to you, and I can't wait till the 1st of July. That's only just over a month away. We can wait for the next instalment with you, Guy, of all the latest things that will be on your mind then. I suspect it might be something about preparation and planning and back to school and all that stuff, but
I suspect so.
Yeah, I suspect so. Yeah, fantastic. Unless there's anything else, Guy.
No, just to wish everyone a happy half term when they've ended the call, and look forward to seeing you again in July. And if there's any questions, we'll deal with them. I promise.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will. Thanks again for your time, Guy. Much appreciated.
Bye bye.
Well, thank you ever so much. Well, there Guy goes, and I'm just going to very quickly, if you need to run, please do, of course, but I'm just going to very quickly share just a couple of little important bits of information about bits that are coming forward in the future. So that was a terrific session. We have another session soon, actually, with the brilliant Hal Roberts. Many of you might know Hal, a terrific teacher, very experienced teacher, author, and above all, a storyteller. So we're going to sit down with Hal and look at how we can unleash our creativity in planning and teaching. And I think that'll be a really interesting, that's actually followed by a very interesting roundtable, which we're going to have with some teachers as well, to look at ways in which they're able to really inject some creativity and tell the story of learning through their planning and their delivering in the classroom. So that will be really interesting. Do join us for that if you can. And I think my colleague will be sharing that in the chat so that you can register for that. And then, as I said, we're back with Guy again soon on the 1st of July to look at another instalment of advice for the current times, all the very latest advice that you need, accompanied by some notes as well, which will be great. And then just in the remaining minutes, I did promise that if you're able to stay, I would actually share with you just a quick glimpse at the Pathway platform if you haven't yet seen it. I hope you're able to see it now. This is the landing page. 3 sections, as you'll probably know by now. Many people on the call might already be using Pathway. If you're not familiar, we have orientation, which is where we have a motivation guide to really help you to understand everything that, all you need to understand about the nature of motivation and how to speak to others in the language of their motivators, and really go through your own job description of all things and understand which elements motivate you and why, and what to do about the elements that don't motivate you. We have a skills audit in orientation section as well, where we look at the teaching skills audit and the leadership skills audit, where you actually go through a whole range of different teaching skills. In the case of the teachers audit, that's based on the DfE teacher standards, and then some leadership competencies, 14 actually, skills and competencies that we've identified, working with experienced head teachers and leadership recruitment consultants, looking at lots of different aspects of leadership, where you have an honest discussion with yourself, where you can rate or rank where you see yourself in those different areas and the areas for development perhaps. And then the career maps. We have these brilliant career mapping tools, and I'll show you one that we made earlier. This is one that you actually build yourself. You ask a series of different questions and you actually compile a career map to show where you wish to go in the years ahead in your professional roles, in those additional skills and interests, those extracurricular activities where you bring so much added value to the school, and your health and wellbeing goals too. And I think that's an important area that mustn't be neglected. And if you wrap all of those together, one hopes that you'll continue to flourish in this important career. And then the navigation, of course, is where we have all the different online courses. And there are many, many, many courses, each one requiring several hours to complete. But because it's online, you can do it in your own time. I'm just going to flag up very quickly, actually. These are all the different courses listed. Diversity, Equality and Inclusion course with the brilliant Pran Patel. Very, very interesting course filled with films to watch, interesting academic thought pieces to read, and some very thought-provoking questions for reflection, which you answer. You can't get them wrong. They're your own reflections. What do you think? How you feel about these issues? and they compile together your professional learning journal that you can keep coming back to again and again. The course doesn't finish when you end it. It's there, it's bookmarked, and you can keep coming back all the time. And there are many, many different courses built like this where you read, watch the films, and answer the questions. And then finally, the reflection section. I did mention I'd show you this with a brilliant wellbeing program by the absolutely wonderful Professor Tim O'Brien, who's an extremely experienced expert in the world of wellbeing. He's a professor of psychology and human development, and we were very lucky to have him share his thoughts on wellbeing and critical reflection. And it's a terrific course filled with roundtable discussions, films with the brilliant Tim himself, and lots of academic thought pieces to read and questions for reflection, the coaching questions that really underpin all of the courses within Pathway, which you can't get wrong. They're your own diary entries in response to the action research and the various different thought pieces that you're reading. So I think it's a very empowering offer and a very different personal approach to CPD. And then finally, you might say the jewel in the crown perhaps is, of course, the Advice Hub, authored by Guy Dudley himself and his team at the NEHT, filled with a number of different tiles, all of which house many, many, many different PDFs, giving you the very latest updates and advice, statutory guidance. And we know in the UK how educational policy and practice changes quite frequently, doesn't it? So stay ahead. I mean, we upload these things all the time. That one I uploaded yesterday about directed time. Many, many different tiles within the Advice Hub, as I said, which you're free to browse through. Lots of different aspects of leadership and teaching. And then finally, we have that wonderful newsletter section. Of course, Pathway is relatively new. It launched just before Christmas. So we're now into April, and this is the 5th newsletter that Guy has just penned. And it's a fantastic store, actually, of lots of different important issues that are very much in the current time, which we hope will help you to be the most successful leader you can be and teacher, and help you to flourish in this important career. Right, so it's a huge cupboard of resources and courses, and I hope you're able to have a little look at it if you haven't already done so. Right, just remains for me to thank everybody for staying on the call, and we look forward very much to seeing you next time. Thank you very much indeed.